Hello everyone dan salam sejahtera. At Open University Malaysia, we view education as a lifelong pursuit, guided by academic integrity and societal relevance. The Rise and Reflect 2025 initiative reflects our academic commitment to bridging scholarly insights with real-world understanding. This series offers a platform where diverse topics are explored thoughtfully, encouraging both intellectual engagement and public awareness. Through these initiatives, we affirm our role as a university that not only delivers knowledge but also nurtures critical reflection and meaningful dialogue. We invite all to benefit from this academic endeavor and to experience learning that continues to evolve with the needs of our time. Thank you.
Alright, Assalamualaikum and salam sejahtera and a very good morning to all. Welcome to another session of the R&R webinar series, proudly brought to you by Open University Malaysia, OUM. So this series is a part of our ongoing efforts to engage with thought leaders and share knowledge with a wider audience. So this R&R webinar series will be published with our strategic partners, TV IKRAM and TV IKIM. It will be broadcasted. So before we begin, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce our esteemed speaker for today. So we have with us Dr. Khairudin. Al-Junied is a tenured professor, associate professor at the National University of Singapore and currently serves as a senior fellow at the Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. He formerly held the Malaysia Chair of Islam in Southeast Asia at the same institution. So over the years, Dr. Khairudin has held visiting professorships at Columbia University under the Fulbright program, the University of Brunei Darussalam, and the University of Malaya. In recognition of his contributions to the Islamic scholarship, he has been named among the 500 most influential Muslims globally for the year 2024 and the year 2025. He's also authored numerous numbers of books and over 30 peer-reviewed articles with recent publications, including Muslim Cosmopolitanism, Hamka, and Islam. So without further ado, I will now invite Dr. Khairudin to begin his presentation. So Dr. Khairudin, you will have the floor.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for tuning in today, and indeed it is an honor to be part and parcel of this program by OUM, a very innovative, I think, university. It's fully online, and that makes it easy actually for students to access many of its lectures and also other activities. Now, what I'm going to share about today is actually very close to all of our hearts. We are going to talk about women, and this is quite ironic because I'm not a woman myself, but of course you don't have to be a woman to talk about the fates and the travels and the trials and tribulations of women in the world, the challenges that they have faced, and more importantly, the importance of women in Southeast Asian history. So today's topic is entitled Bringing Women Back In, not that they have never been inside the stories of Southeast Asia, but what I want to do is to try and reflect power dynamics in Southeast Asian historiography, how women have played a big role in shaping power in Southeast Asia. And I will explain what I mean by power and why we need to now rethink how we look at Southeast Asian past. I will go on four directions or four modes or four concentric circles. I will start first by sharing with you on the global historiography of women, the works that have been produced all this while on the history of women, and some of the more recent trends that we see. And then we're going to talk about the idea of power in the Malay world. Power, as we know, the word power in Malay is kuasa, and we always ask the basic question, who has the most power in the Malay society? Is it men or women or both, or sometimes men, sometimes women, and so forth and so forth. And then we're going to dive into the whole idea of the forms of power that women hold in society. Now, even if men claim to have a lot of power in the Malay world, the reality, as I will show, is that women actually wield the most power in this region. And you don't have to go far, just ask your parents who actually decide on the main expenditures in the house. It's always mak lah yang berikan kata mutakhir. So we always know that women play a big role in Southeast Asian societies, and then we will conclude and have a small discussion following my presentation. Now let us begin first with the global historiography of women. Now there have been many trends and an upsurge of writings on women all over the world today, and we know that one big trend that you see in the study of women has to do with feminism. And this is where a lot of the perspectives and that have been put out there when it comes to the writing of the history of women emphasize on the agency of women in shaping Southeast Asian societies. So we have books such as Women Warriors in Southeast Asia, Women Who Fight for the Independence of Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and so forth. We have also writings on women's movement in Southeast Asia, the study of personalities such as Samsia Fakih, Rosa di Camara, Suyatin Kartowiono, and so forth, Kartini. So a lot of these works that you see right now emphasize on how important women have been in the shaping of Southeast Asian past. Now, the interesting part about the feminist literature is that it is not only concerned about the agency of women, but it is also concerned on how women and men worked together to realize a new society for the Malay world and especially for Southeast Asia as a whole. And of course, when we talk about feminist history, as Jun Hanam said it well, that although gender history has increased in popularity, research into women's history continues to strive. So despite of all of these developments in feminism, there have been a whole upsurge of writings on women all over Southeast Asia and in the world. The expansion of higher education opened up more jobs for women academics who were able to influence the curriculum and to introduce women history courses. So because there are more women now, in fact, if you look at Malaysia, I had the liberty to teach at the University of Malaya, especially in the arts and social sciences, you have actually more women than men now teaching in many of these universities. And all of these have played a big role in shaping the historiography of women in Southeast Asia. Now, the other strand of histories that you see now that is developing is on the issue of mobilities. We always think that women do not move a lot and that women are actually people who stay within certain homelands. They're very domesticated. But the reality is such that women have traveled all over the world. Historians now try to uncover many of these issues of mobilities. They emphasize on the long and varied history of population movement, displacement, exile, and immigration. So the book by Fiona Reid and Country Holden here talks about women on the move, and we talk about, and they discuss about refugees, people who migrate, and people who exile. We should also stress the particular role of women in population movement. Currently, if you look at the figures, and this is about 10 years ago, about 80% of all refugees are actually women and children. So women constitute the biggest bulk of the people who move from one place to another. So think about Gaza, for example. The movement of women from one place to another is so huge. And we're talking about refugees from Syria, from Libya, and so forth and so forth. And they require our attention. And of course, we must also look at other developments in Southeast Asia, such as sex trafficking, which is a big issue, which is linked to human trafficking as well. I'm sure Malaysians who are listening in would have already encountered certain news reports where women were kidnapped from their villages and then were sold to slavery, basically sex slavery. And of course, we know about domestic work. A lot of the people who are working in our homes now are actually women, and they constitute a big number in Southeast Asia, mostly coming from Burma, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So the point I'm trying to make here is that not only do the feminists become the centerpiece of many of the studies on women, but there are a lot of scholars who are looking at the movement of women all over the world. Now, the other strand that we need to pay attention to is the study of body politics. I'm going to talk about this later on when we talk about women's reproductive function. That a lot of studies now are concerned with how women's bodies are so powerful in shaping society. And this book, edited by Tony Ballantyne and Antoniette Burton, Bodies in Contact, they argue that what is striking, however, is the extent to which women's bodies, and to a lesser degree, men's, have been a subject of concern, scrutiny, anxiety, surveillance in a variety times and places all over the world. They focus on women to reorient again imperial history and to show how this gendered, sexualized context had shaped basically the colonial environment. Now, the study of women's bodies is so important now, and if I have time, aside from all the work that I'm currently doing, I would like to do some research on the whole hijab industry all over the world. There have been a lot of studies on hijab, but have not been a global study of hijab, not only as a trend, but as a new kind of emerging business. It's $1 trillion business. Forget about Nilofer, forget about all of the Malaysian brands now, Duck and so forth and so forth. Now Dolce & Gabbana, Adidas, Nike, they're all entering into this hijab industry. So women's bodies are things that we need to pay attention to. So 3 strands of historiography that we need to be concerned with: feminism, mobilities, and body politics. And there have been a lot of books that talk about women's villing. This book by Eric Jones on wives, slaves, and concubines show how women's bodies have been subjected to a lot of oppression in the colonial context, but it is happening until today. Think of the domestic workers that are in many of the homes that you see in Malaysia right now. They work very long hours. We hear of stories of many of these domestic workers all over Southeast Asia who are subjected to a lot of abuse, and you're talking about bodily abuse. And all of these are things that we need to pay attention to when we talk about women and gender. Now, that leads me then to the idea of power. All of these studies that have been done on the historiography of women point to one thing, that either women do not have power in society, or women have actually a lot of power and exerting themselves in the societies that are now evolving in Southeast Asia. But before we talk about women's power, we need to understand the concept of power in the Malay world. How do Malays understand power? And when we talk about Malays or the Malay world, we should include the Javanese, the Bugis, the Boyanis, and so forth and so forth. Now, let's start with the Javanese because they are basically the largest group within the Malay world. In the book by Benedict Anderson, Language and Power, Exploring Political Cultures in Indonesia, the famous scholar Benedict Anderson says that the Javanese, and you can apply it also to the Malays, see power as something concrete. That means power is manifested in brutality sometimes, in assertion, in rules, in regulation. Homogeneous, that means power comes in one form that exerts itself onto society, and constant in total quantity, and without inherent moral implications as such. What he's saying here is that the Javanese conception of power is very, very nuanced. It's very, very diffuse. That power is not only top-down. Power also exists at an everyday life. Power is exerted by people of different levels of society. And they may not have moral implications. That means when power is asserted into society, it may not change society towards a moral direction. It can change the society from a material sense, and so forth and so forth. The big point that Benedict Anderson is trying to make here is that the Javanese conception of power, kuasa, is very, very sophisticated. And the same is it with Malays. If you observe Malays very, very carefully, and I've lived with them, I'm among them as well, and I consider myself as one of them, the ways in which Malays push power into society, into families, into the people around them is always very subtle, but very, very effective. And this is what Benedict Anderson is trying to emphasize here. The work by Sherry Arrington, The Subject of Power in Southeast Asia, in an edited book on Southeast Asian perspectives on power, she says that new worlds and new formations of knowledge, power and polity are now emerging, and with them new topics and new subject matter, as well as new subjectivities and new ways of constituting and authorizing power. What she's basically trying to say here is that we now need to change our conceptions of power from what has been understood by the West to look at how Southeast Asians understand it in a totally different way. Now, Benedict Anderson has basically thrown the first stone to say that the Javanese has an interesting idea of power. Now, what would be the idea of power amongst the Malays, amongst the Bugis, amongst the Javanese, and so forth and so forth? Sharing-Arrington says that rather than investigating the nature and characteristics of entities within stable categories, people are studying the emergence of categories and narratives which are at once material and fraught with meaning, and which are constructed within layers of differing powers and institutions. Now, to put it very simply, we need not understand power as it has been practiced in Malay societies in a manner to which the West understood it. Rather, our duty as people from Southeast Asia, while we derive from a lot of the historiographies that have been written so far from the West and from somewhere else, is to understand power among Southeast Asians in their own terms. And this is where we need to understand women's power in Southeast Asia from the perspectives of women themselves. So even if I'm a man studying women in Southeast Asia, I am trying to sell this idea to everyone who's listening in, that we need to understand power from the eyes of women themselves. And to understand power from the eyes of women themselves require us to dig deeper into the sources that we have in Southeast Asia, to read them in a very, very analytical way, and to try and theorize with new concepts and new narratives women's power in Southeast Asia. So let's now get and dive into the forms of women power in Southeast Asia. And as I'm discussing the forms of women power in Southeast Asia, I will ask some questions, because these questions will be areas of future research that all of the students and the staff who are listening in can actually develop. And indeed, I feel that a lot of the questions that I'm going to ask here are things that you can use for your PhD projects, your masters, and your term papers, and so forth and so forth. So one book that I would recommend for you to read is this one by Barbara Watson Andaya. She and her husband wrote the famous The History of Malaysia. But one of the iconic books that she has written throughout her very long career as a historian is this book entitled The Flaming Wound, Repositioning Women in Early Modern Southeast Asia. Even though she discussed early modern Southeast Asia, a lot of her conclusions are so important in us trying to understand how women actually manifest and express power in Southeast Asian societies. Now, the first form of power, go back to my point earlier on bodies, that women in Southeast Asia have is the power of procreation. And we know, especially historically, women were very powerful because fertility was regarded as an asset. The fact that a woman can give birth gives her a lot of power, be it in courts or in families on the ground. Because the Rajas want children that can continue the name of the throne or the name of the family. And this is where women can be powerful when they do not allow the Rajas or the people on the ground to have children. So the whole idea of procreating, of giving birth, is a form of power in itself. And that's why if you speak to your grandmother, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-grandmother, in the past, Malays especially, and of course non-Malays who lived in the Malay world, they would have a lot of children. Why do they have a lot of children? Because children provided manpower for the family. That's one. But children are also seen as a form of wealth. Children were regarded as an embodiment of the fertility of the mother, but more importantly, how the mother is so powerful in the fact that she could actually give birth to as many children as possible. So during the pre-modern period, women who bore a lot of children were held in high esteem. That's why when you talk to the old guards, they are so proud when they say that they have 12 children, 16 children, 24 children, and so forth and so forth. And a fertile body is always highly regarded than a well-shaped body. So today, Hollywood and all of the social media would like us to believe that a well-shaped body is what we should be going after. People are showing how they go to the gyms and so forth and so forth. In the past, the well-shaped body is not what people seek for. People are seeking for women with bodies that can procreate. And that's why if you ever heard this before, maybe many of you are listening in are a bit too young. Perempuan yang punggungnya besar. They say that women with big, how do you say it in English? With their backs that are big are more preferred in the past than those who are small and petite and so forth and so forth. Now, the question that we need to ask when it comes to the power to procreate is, why have ideas regarding women's procreative powers changed, right? Why did it change? Why is it that in the past, having a lot of children, when a woman have a lot of children, she is regarded as not only fertile, but very powerful. But now, many people loathe having children. Why is it that women themselves now do not see this as a form of power in itself? What happened to society? Why did we change our idea of power? Because the less children that you have, the less you have manpower in your family. And of course, that affects everybody else. So that's one question that we need to try and unravel, right? Why did this power of procreation actually change? The other form of power that you can see in the Malay community or Malay world in the past is what we can call as domestic power. Now, women, even though they stayed at home, historically, and sometimes even until now, were masters and guardians of the homes. And domestic power means that they have control of not only the home, but things that are happening in it. Knowledge of the home allowed women to assert their authority whenever they deemed necessary, and they became cultural brokers and gatekeepers of norms and values. So when women stays at home, they're not only there to manage the home and to keep the homes clean, but they were also people who ensure that the cultures of the home is maintained. That's why when you go to kampong communities and you see marriages happening and people want to get married, the first people that they need to consult are not actually the men, but actually the women, because the women are the ones who are the gatekeepers of cultures in a given family. So the other form of power that we do not see is actually domestic powers. Try to ask your dad who actually decides on the major issues in your home. Your dad will readily say it's actually your mother who will who give the final stand. But when the mother meets everybody else, she's just quiet. So this is the powerful thing about women. Their powers are subtle, but they are often very effective. Now, what's interesting now, the question that we need to ask when it comes to domestic power is, with the increasing number of women working outside the home, do women actually still wield power in domestic sphere as they did in the past? So now women are not staying home. They are not so very in tune with what's happening at home. If in the past the mother is at home, the mother knows what's happening to the children, the mother knows who comes in and who comes out. Now the mother comes out in the morning and comes back in the late afternoon. Nothing is at home. Sometimes only the domestic worker is at home. What is happening right now? Do they still have domestic power like they used before? Do women now still maintain the same role as cultural brokers and gatekeepers as they had in the past, right? The third form of power is the power of specialized labor. So just now, we talked about the domestic power. When women stay at home, they also do certain tasks. So historically, women worked in the fields. They gathered while men hunted, right? And that means that they also know the environment around them. If you look at the histories of the Malay world, women were actually expert traders. And this is still there when you travel to places like Terengganu and Kelantan. If you go to the markets of Terengganu and Kelantan, most of the women are actually in the markets. Where are the men? Don't ask me. They are somewhere out there, mostly in the coffee shops. Now, women for many hundred years were controlling businesses in this part of the world. And because they were controlling businesses in many states such as Aceh, Patani, and others, they not only functioned as ambassadors, they also became queens. In many places within Indonesia, from the 16th all the way until the 19th century, there were many women queens that basically managed a lot of these sultanates that were there. They married foreign merchants and dignitaries, and they bore many children, the power of procreation, accumulated a lot of wealth, and then went their separate ways. So nowadays, when people look at the Malay community, for example, We always say that, oh, Malays are always having divorce. Divorce in the Malay world is normal in the past. A woman would be divorced at least 3 to 4 times within her lifetime. But as they got divorced, they actually accumulated wealth in Southeast Asia. That was possible in the past because there was an arrangement where when women get divorced from the men, even though they may be foreigners, have to leave their children as well as their wealth behind. So women actually benefited from divorce because they were highly specialized, because they were working not only in the homes, but they were also managing businesses. And that is a form of power in itself. And with the coming of modernity, that power then fizzled out. What global capitalism has done is to make men and women share the same specialized labor. And that's why when we go to work now, the majority of people at work nowadays are actually women. There's no specialization anymore. The man goes out to get money for the family. The women goes out to get the money for the family. Nobody has domestic power because domestic power now becomes shared. But more importantly, even outside, both of them have the same specialization. The power of women then become very diluted because of this arrangement. Now, the question that we need to ask is, how has global capitalism transformed the types of labor that women engage in? And what are the implications of this? Now, with the coming of global capitalism, with the bringing together of men and women into the same market, competing for the same jobs, the women who used to have specialized labor now do not have it anymore. So power now becomes even more diluted because of global capitalism and modernity. So if you want to read more about the idea of the division of labor in society, you can read the book, the classic book by Emile Durkheim, where he talks about how the traditional societies used to have men and women working in different places and different occupations. And because of that, they have more control over their own respective specializations and the people around them. And last but not least, is the power of marriage and remarriage. And I mentioned this earlier on. Women could divorce anytime they want to. And divorced women were actually in high demand in the past. Divorce was not a taboo in the past. As mentioned by Anthony Reid, the pan-Southeast Asian pattern of women autonomy meant that divorce did not markedly reduce a woman's livelihood status or network of kin support. Now, the question that we need to ask then is, why has divorce become a social stigma now, and to what effect? If in the past, divorce actually enriched many of these women, what is happening now to our society? With the rise of nuclear families, divorce have actually caused a lot of poverty, especially in a country like Singapore. The power of marriage and remarriage is now again taken away from women. So I just want to end. The last point that I want to bring up with regards to the power of women is the what we call as myth power. I was like contemplating whether I should actually present this one, but maybe we should talk about it. That in the Malay society and in other societies in the Malay world, mythology and folklore is a big thing. There have been myths about women all over Southeast Asia linked to this whole idea of women having myth power is sorcery, or what we call as sihir or witchcraft. When we talk about witchcraft, we always talk about women first, nenek kebayan. And we always say, don't mess with a pregnant woman, because if you mess with a pregnant woman, what happens? She becomes a Puntiana. And then you know that there are a lot of movies about Puntiana. Now, that's one interesting thing that people don't realize, that when we look at all of the ghost stories in Southeast Asia, the most powerful hantu in Southeast Asia has always been the women hantu. Why? Because it shows how women are so powerful in Southeast Asia. And go back to my issue about the power of procreation, right? The lady died because she wanted to give birth. She was not taken care of. She becomes a ghost, and she starts hunting for men all over the place, right? So all of these things tell us that myth is very, very important. Myth attached to women define women's power in societies. Now, many of these myths actually fulfill many functions. They ensure the physical protection of women in society. Stories of hantu actually help to protect women in the past, because if you see a woman walking home, you don't want to disturb the woman. She might just be Puntiana. So these myths actually had a very powerful function. They enforce customary laws that are in place. The customary laws in the past is that women who are pregnant ought to be taken care of like queens so that the child will be healthy. And if you don't take care of her and she dies and she becomes Pontianak, she will haunt the house. The myths also help to maintain harmonious relations in the household. So take care of your wife, or else she dies and then she will haunt you for the rest of the life. So all of these stories of hantu, whether it's true or not, is not something I'm interested in, but they are actually used as a form of power. It could be that women actually told these stories. I've not heard any newspaper reports telling that someone died because he was hunted by Pontianak. But the stories of Pontianak are so powerful that people are afraid of Pontianak more than anything else in their lives. And that actually shows how powerful myths are in the Malay community, especially myths about women. So now we need to ask the question, if when we look at domestic power, specialized labor, and so forth, there's a kind of like dilution or declining power of women in those aspects. But why is it when it comes to myth power, women are still very powerful? So how do we explain the endurance of these myths till the present day? We have become so modernized, we become so Islamized to some people, people have become more rationalized, people have become more, even if you're not a Muslim, even if you're a Christian or any other religion, people are now becoming more and more rational, but people still believe in many of these myths. Why is it still there? When other things are declining, myths are not declining. Of course, we can blame the movie directors for making all of these Pontianak stories and ghost stories, but within societies itself, why are people still believing in this? And why is it still powerful until today are the things that we need to talk about when we talk about the power of women. So I just would like to conclude by saying that the historiography of women is going to expand very widely than ever before now. And the reason has to do with the fact that a lot of women are actually contributing to this expanding literature. And one aspect of this expanding literature is the power of women. And as I've mentioned, we need to have a more nuanced, a more sophisticated ideas. We need to have more sophisticated ideas of how to understand the power of women in society. Power may not be necessarily political power. Yes, there are women in politics arguing for places in parties and so forth. But power also can be expressed in other areas, be it in domestic areas, be it in labor, be it in procreation, be it in myth, be it in trade, and so forth. And the reality is that women, for many hundred years, have been very powerful in Southeast Asian history. They still have power until today, but we need to open up our eyes, change our lenses, and look at their agency properly in order for us to uncover the forms of power that have always been there amongst women in Southeast Asian and in the Malay society. So I will just end here. Maybe we have a bit of discussion on the topic. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for your insight. And I can say on the behalf of the audience that the topic today is actually very interesting, that we have uncovered the role of women in history and the extended elaborations on the discourse. So Dr. Khairudin, we only have one question for today, and the question is regarding the marriage and remarriage. You mentioned about that divorce was historically not seen as a taboo, and then divorced women were still socially valued, and then it happens on the stigmatization of divorce. So the question is, what happened that led to the stigmatization of divorce, particularly for women? Is it because of the colonial rule? Is it because of religious beliefs? Or is it because of the modern capitalist forces that led into this shift? So that would be the question that we have for today.
Okay, very good. So the stigmatization, I think, began when the British, the Dutch, the Spanish, and other colonial powers came into this part of the world. And they brought with them Christian ideas of marriage and divorce. Now, in Christianity, you are supposed to be married till death do us part. And divorce has always been shunned upon, except for some Protestant groups that actually accept the arrangement. And those ideas were implemented by way of laws in Southeast Asian societies. Although they respected Islamic laws, what the colonial powers did was to put up ideas that marriage has to stay within a given arrangement till the person actually dies. And this was new to Southeast Asian people, because even before the coming of Islam, divorce was actually very high. So what the Muslims actually had inherited is actually a pre-Islamic idea of marriage and divorce, that marriages are not necessarily permanent, and that being divorced is not something that is bad. Now, the colonial powers had already changed that through their ideology. But the thing that made it even more powerful or even more influential, the whole idea that divorce is a stigma, was the post-colonial state. Now, when Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and other countries were established, many of the states implemented the very laws and ideologies that the colonial powers left behind. People start taking statistics, and the statistics have it that Malays, they have this number of divorce. Chinese have certain numbers of divorce, and Indians have certain numbers of divorce. Divorce was not only quantified, but also racialized. And it becomes tied to social problems. The problem became even more chronic, not only because of quantification, but also because of the housing arrangements that were changed. If in the past, women who get divorced would just go back. In Sumatra, they say, pulang ke rumah mamaknya. That means you go back to your uncle's house. Your uncle, your father, your brother had the duty to take care of you until you get married again. You go back to your new husband. So they lived in a communal way where a divorced woman would always get help from their families. But what happened in the post-colonial period was the rise of cities and urban living, where people start staying separated from one another. And when they get a divorce, with the ideology that's already been implemented by the colonial powers and continued by the post-colonial state, the women who are left behind by the men are now seen as single parents. So this new term came about, which was never the case in the past, because there's no such thing as single parent. Even though the lady is divorced, she goes back to her uncle's or her parents' house, there are still parents around. If you don't call them parent, you call them grandparents. That's why if you look at a lot of the accounts of kampung people who the mother or the father got a divorce, the children will still call their grandfather ayah and ibu, because the idea of a parent is far more fluid than how the modern people actually defined it. So we can blame, and you're right to say that we can blame multiple successive waves of forces that have asserted themselves into Malay society, the forces of colonialism, the forces of modernity, the roles of the post-colonial state, and more importantly, I would say, also the wrongful idea of divorce, especially within the Muslim community itself, right? They developed this whole idea that divorce is bad. Yes, it is to a great extent, because it leads to imbalance when it comes to raising the child. But the bad that has been defined because of the coming of certain movements from certain parts of the world led to stigmatization. In the Arab world and in India, in South Asia, divorce is seen as something really, really bad. But not in this part of the world. Not that divorce is celebrated where, bersatu kita tegur, bercerai kahwin lagi kind of talk. But what people in this part of the world understood was that divorce need not actually mean disenfranchisement. That means you are not taken out from the wealth that you have. You're not taken out from the family that you have. There is an alternative. There was and have been alternative arrangements for people who are divorced. So that idea, that way of thinking that came, because I do not want to say that it is from Islam, it's actually from culture, from the Arab world and from South Asia, came into this part of the world. People adopted this, and that all of this actually led to divorce being seen as something that is utterly negative. Now, I wish to qualify here, because the people listening in might get the wrong idea to say, okay, now I'm going to get a divorce. Because Khairudin said that divorce should not be seen as bad. So since it's not bad, let's just do it. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that divorce in the Malay society was accepted precisely because marriage, or the idea of marriage, the understanding of marriage is far wider than me marrying a woman. Rather, the idea of marriage included extended families, where parents come into the picture, where the village also helped to ensure that the marriages work. And if the marriages don't work, the child would be taken care of also by the villagers. If you have such an arrangement, and if the marriage just couldn't work out, and there are problems within the relationship between husband and wife, by all means, divorce might be an alternative. But it is not a magic pill for many of the issues that we may face in an everyday life. Okay. Yeah.
All right. What a brilliant answer, Dr. Khairudin, on the question of marriage and remarriage. And I think that will be all the questions that we have for today. So, ladies and gentlemen, and Dr. Khairudin, we have come to the end of our R&R session for today. We would like to thank Dr. Khairudin. It is a privilege to have a distinguished scholar whose work continues to inspire and challenge us all, especially in this topic of women and feminism, and its again extended roles. So for our viewers, we would like to say thank you so much for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe and follow our social media. And we wish you thank you very much and have a pleasant day. So thank you very much, Dr. Khairudin, and everyone.